The title that was in the email this morning is the title that would have been today had we not spent most of last week on talking about the horrible situation in Israel-Palestine. And that, of course, is crucial to talk about Islam, not necessarily my experiences, but in general, how those of us that work in the interfaith world, some of the differences between what it means to be in touch, especially over text, with Muslims compared to, say, with Christians of different kinds. We're going to continue what we started last week, though. We're not going to go to that topic yet. We'll get to it next week. On Muslims, perhaps I'll be able to introduce it, but I do want to finish the rest of the page that we began. The page is in the chat box for those that need it, the link. And before that, I want to open with a prayer, of course, that we're not only conscious and sensitive towards our fellow Jews in the state of Israel, but we're conscious to our fellow human beings and the suffering that's involved. And I certainly do not want to talk about what should happen from a military point of view, but from a humanitarian point of view. I want us to pray. I'm not arguing for one set of actions or another. I want us to pray that we continue to have compassion, no matter our feelings of justice, which we call justice, which sometimes is more perhaps revenge than justice, of anger. And I want us to keep a space in our heart, as I mentioned last week in our prayer as well, for compassion for the other. Mishaberach Avotenu Abraham v'Sarah, Yitzchak v'Rivka, Yaakov, Rachel v'Leah. Way the one who blessed and protected our ancestors, continue to protect them and bring about eventually the blessings of peace. May God guide the actions of each and every Israeli combatant person at home with a sense of love, a sense of justice, with a sense of responsibility, and with a sense of compassion for the other. May God grant healing to all those who have suffered the shock, the terror, the horror of unspeakable deeds. May God heal their souls as God will heal their bodies. May God send wisdom and knowledge and compassion to all those who are taking care of them. May we all acknowledge in this difficult time that each and every human being has been created in God's image. B'Tselem Elohim. And that acting like God is not so much cutting off the life of another, but bringing life to others. May God give us the strength to stand up for what we believe in, to protect ourselves from undue damage to our souls through overexposure, through insensitivity. Oseh shalom bimromav, uyaseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol shchinenu, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel. May the one who has brought order into this world, into this creation, and the possibility of peace, show us here down on earth how we might bring about that same order, that same peace, not only for us as a community, for us as Israel, and for all of our neighbors and all inhabitants of this world. And let us say Amen. I would like to dive into the study now as part of our therapy, if you will, and mention something I neglected to mention last week when I introduced my first visit to Taizé, the community in Burgundy, France, that I have visited so many times and will be there again, hopefully, in December. And that is, I was scheduled to be there for 2 weeks. I left after a week because, as I mentioned to you, everybody wanted to talk to me. They hadn't met a Jew, let alone a rabbi. I'm talking about all the young people that were there, and more of the brothers warmed up as the days went on that I was there and wanted to have private conversations. And I realized that I still have to write something for my PhD dissertation, which, fast forward, as I mentioned last week, I never ended up finishing. But at the time, it would seem to be an immediate need. And so I packed my stuff and I drove to another part of the country and found a very peaceful place where I could sit and walk. And it was near an abbey, which was inhabited by 3 monks. And there were people that would come there and visit. It's a place that Christians visit. It's called Conques, near the river Lot. And I went there because a friend of mine in Israel once said, if you're ever in France, in that particular area, you must see this place. And I went there. And I came towards the evening hoping to find a prayer, hoping to find prayer that would be like Taizé. Of course, there was none. But one of the brothers, one of the monks, was playing on piano, this big grand piano. And as I walk in, he had no idea I was there. Nobody knew. It wasn't that everybody knew there was an Israeli there, or there was a Jew or a rabbi. It's kind of a tourist town. It's a low-key tourist town. And when and he doesn't know where I've been, right? And I walk in, and a few minutes later, he begins to play on piano, Erev Shel Shoshanim. La la da 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 da. Da 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 da. La da 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 da. And I'm saying to myself, it's not like that's a famous folk song. I mean, I guess it is in those circles, but it's not like it's a French folk song that was made into an Israeli song. It's not like Greensleeves that I use for prayer. It would seem to be rather significant at the time, and I'm not one that's looking for signs. But the next song that he played was, in the Lord I'll be ever thankful. In the Lord I will rejoice. Look to God, do not be afraid. Lift up your voices, the Lord is near. Lift up your voices, the Lord is near. Now, some of you who pray with us at Orami Bar know that, and know that I've used that melody for Psalm 92, the Song of Shabbat, which I already figured out worked in my first visit of Taizé that first week. And I'm thinking to myself, how could this man possibly know what that piece of music from Taizé, where I've just come from, was so important to me? And I took those things as signs. I'm not saying they're miraculous. I'm not saying that God has chosen me for a purpose that is not chosen for other people. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying, looking around my life and interpreting symbols. And I understood then that for me, Taizé was going to continue to be an important source of hope, of interfaith dialogue, of learning prayer and music, learning a pluralistic approach to not only to religion, but to Judaism, in my case specifically. And I did what I did. I got some work done, and I had to drive back to Paris, where I was staying the night with my good friends Pauline Beb and Tom Cohen. They're both rabbis in Paris. Each of them have their own synagogues. And we're sitting in their tiny little apartment having some coffee. And somebody calls them and says, you have to turn on the TV set. And it was the site of the Twin Towers on 9/11. And they went out to deal with their congregations. They had things planned. I kind of wandered around in a daze, looking at CNN or any kind of TV I could see in the cafes. And because I was on a flight with El Al, and El Al has, flies under many conditions that other airlines don't. I was able actually to go back the next day to Israel. And so Taizé became a crucial point in my life, also because of the timing that my visit was in the history of the world, the history of the United States. And I am American, even though I was an Israeli at the time, and I was in France. And so two things came out of that short time in Paris before getting on the plane. Number one was, I'm looking out the window. They live in Rue de Rosier, which is the old Jewish quarter. And I felt that what this was happening, that I wanted to be with the community in prayer. And it was Mincha time. Those that may know, it's the afternoon service, the late afternoon service. And the yeshiva down the block, I could see people were going towards the yeshiva. And I thought to myself, maybe I should go there. But ultra-Orthodox Jews, although I come from that world a little bit, I don't have a great place in my heart for camaraderie, so to speak, especially in this situation. And I even considered canceling my flight, renting another car, and driving down to Taizé, the 3.5, 4 hours, so I could be with the brothers in prayer at that particular time. That's one thing. The next thing, already before I got on the plane, I said to myself, okay, Lazar, this is your direction now. You've stayed away from, I was very active in HIV, AIDS, and LGBTQ plus community in the 90s, in my rabbinate in the 90s. This was 2001. I'd stayed at the edges of peace activism and interfaith dialogue, not because I wasn't interested, but because I felt I have, my plate is full, and I have a congregation, and I have my own studies. I was in the doctoral program. I had, my plate was full, and I said, okay, now you need to make room for this. And we say in Hebrew, gamarti belibi. I decided in my heart, or I finished it. It was decided, it was finalized. I finalized it in my heart that this would be a main area of action for me. And indeed it became. And that's part of the introduction from last week that I kind of left out in my lack of focus, but very much part of that psalm as well that we looked at, Psalm 117, that I brought to you not only to show that that's an example of music created in one place, sacred music, for the same text in Latin can apply to Hebrew words. And Thomas, I don't know if you were able to see the recording, but you will certainly know the words Laudate omnes gentes, Laudate Dominum, Laudate omnes gentes, Laudate Dominum, which became in Hebrew, Hallelu et Adonai kol goyim, Shabchu kol ha'umim. I said it became in Hebrew, it actually was in Hebrew. It's one of those miraculous little things. Perhaps another sign, again, not woo-woo sign that I'm special and that I'm being directed, personally by God, and it's not my theology. At least it certainly isn't always my theology, but it does let me know that I feel that I'm on the right track in what I'm doing. And so we took a look last week at that psalm and how two very divergent understandings, the Rabbi David Kimchi and St. Paul's letter to the Romans. I don't want to go over that again. For those who would like, you can see yet another interpretation in Augustine, Saint Augustine. But I went back to Israel, and I immediately was in touch with certain people that I knew had those connections. One of the key people in interfaith dialogue in my life, and although he doesn't deal with it so much anymore, is Yossi Klein Halevi, who many of you have heard speak before. Perhaps you know him, you've read his books. He wrote a book called In the Entrance to the Garden of Eden. And I knew about the book because he had been sent to do a piece on me for the Jerusalem Report in 1997, I think, and he spent a whole week with me. And instead of asking me questions and listening to what I had to say, he's a reporter, he's a journalist. Now he's quite famous. At the time he wasn't as famous. He did most of the talking during that week, and I learned a tremendous amount. And he went with me to the Israel AIDS Task Force Memorial that we had organized, and to visit the sick and talking to a gay lesbian community center. He did a lot of things with me in communal work and wrote about it. I was very flattered. But he wrote this book, which was really interesting. His encounters, mystical encounters with Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land, in Israel, in the late 90s. It's a really important book, and most of you have never heard about it, even though you may have heard of other books that he wrote. And the reason that is, the publication date was 9/11, 2001. That's when the book came out. And it got totally lost. And most people literally don't know about it. And once you launch a book like that, it's hard to get it relaunched. It's a really important book because it shows the commonality that I spoke about last week, the things we have in common and how to build, as Chazan Marsha just wrote, Malin B'Kodesh, to take a secular melody by applying it to a sacred text. Chazan, the truth is, it was not a secular melody. I don't know where Greensleeves comes from, but I use Greensleeves all the time. That might be the case, but Napoleon's Nigun that the Chabadnikim sing at the end of Yom Kippur, that would be a good example of that. This is a tune that was actually written b'kedusha, right? So I don't know if it's Malin b'kodesh or it's Mashvin b'kodesh, equally Kodesh, if you will. Okay, so back to this. I came back to Israel and I got in touch with Yossi Klein Halevi, who was an expert, put me in touch with somebody else. He says, you know who he says, it's really hard to find imams with whom to speak, because that was the issue. The issue is, how do I, as a Jewish communal leader, speak with Muslim communal leaders in the land of Israel, in Palestine? How do we do that? And that, of course, you may know, is politically very daunting. And I will speak about that next week, inshallah, God willing. But right now, I want to go. So the water had to flow someplace, and I wasn't finding a way for this water, these fluids, to flow in the Muslim direction. So I started to be in touch with different Christian leaders. And unfortunately, they were all, at the time, foreigners, transplants, right? And not indigenous Palestinian Christian leaders. That happened a little bit later, and I will mention that. But the person who I began the warmest connection with almost right away, because of who he is, who his soul is Father Franz of the Beatitudes. In the next section, the text we're going to get to, I discovered the commonalities, if you will, through my connections with the Beatitudes. And for those that are just joining us today, this is a class which is a combination of personal narrative. My experiences is what Rabbi Marsha asked me to do, and my insistence and her agreement, of course, that there be text involved. So we will get to the text, but the story is, I got in touch with these folks, with Father Franz, who's the prior, who was at the time the prior being, like, it's kind of like parallel to what you would call an abbot, but a prior is the key person amongst many in a monastic order, and his community, called the Community of the Beatitudes, is a branch of a much larger, not so much international, but certainly European. There's one, they have one house, they call them houses or homes, Bait, in Denver, Colorado, but otherwise well known in France and Switzerland and Germany, or more well known, perhaps not so much in Italy, but Germany. And Father Franz is German, and they bring together under the Roman Catholic Church, though not recognized as an order, because they're kind of out there. They're kind of, well, I'll give you some examples in a moment. They're not your typical order of monks. First of all, they have brothers and sisters who have taken vows of celibacy and commitment to the community that live in the same complex, and they also have families, because they believe you should hear the voices of children. When I heard that, automatically I said, this is something that's this is so interesting. And they live in a place in Israel, called one of the three places that have been assigned to the biblical site of Emmaus from the New Testament, where Jesus first showed himself to the two people that didn't know it was him when they're walking by the way. And this is the one that is it's kind of halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Many of you may know where the Latrun Monastery is. There's like an Israeli army museum of tanks that's next to it, but there's a older monastery with vineyards. They even make wine. It's not great wine, but it's kind of cool to have wine made by monks in Israel. Some people would say that's exactly the wine you're not allowed to have from Jewish tradition, because it was made, theoretically, it's made for them to do communion, the Eucharist, and many people in Jewish history of rabbinic decisions have decided that that's part of idolatry, and we'll get to that eventually as well. I certainly don't think that's the case, and neither do many rabbis, including Orthodox rabbis. But next, across the street, across the highway from Latrun, is a Carmelite monastery. The Carmelites are an order of sisters, and they have a lot of property. At one time, they had quite a few places in Israel. It's the Carmelites who are on top of Mount Tabor. I don't know if any of you have done this kind of traveling in Israel before, been to these places. But they weren't using it, and the Beatitudes rented from them or got it from them. I'm not sure how the arrangement. It's a beautiful building with bougainvillea hanging down, archway windows. Many people pass by, they have no idea what it is. And I went there to visit them. I went there for their prayer and to be with them. So here's one of my rules of interfaith engagement is that in the same way that we believe that the world rests on three pillars, on Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim, on study, on worship or spiritual practice, and the acts of loving kindness or fixing the world. I think the key to serious, for me, serious and lasting and meaningful interfaith dialogue is to go on those three pathways. And very often, rabbis, especially conservative, certainly Orthodox rabbis who are involved in this, do not feel comfortable praying. They may come to visit a church, to be there as spectators. And what Taizé taught me was, I want to be a participant and not just a spectator. And so soon afterwards, Father Franz came with some of the brothers and sisters to our Kabbalat Shabbat. It turns out this group, they themselves do Kabbalat Shabbat. They chant in Hebrew to Karlebach music. It's so strange when I found out about this. They have a very, at least the house that's in Israel, have a very, very rich connection with other Jews. And they've adopted some of those practices. One of those practices is they do Kabbalat Shabbat. Another practice they have is they make Havdalah at the end of Shabbat, and then they do Israeli folk dances. They love folk dancing together. And then they do their mass, Saturday night and Sunday morning, etc. And there are some people from the area that come to be part of their congregation, some Christian Arabs, or some mostly French foreign employees at the embassy and things like that are part of their community. And so they came to us for Friday night, and Father Franz comes, and they're there, and they're wearing their regular clothes, civilian clothes. Now, when they're in the monastery, they wear these beautiful long habits, brown and white habits. And I said, "What are your habits?" He says, "Well, we didn't want to offend anybody." I said, No. Here in my synagogue in Tel Aviv, Ramat Aviv, this is an honor for us. Please, when you come again, please dress the way you dress. And so the next time they came, a few weeks later, and I see them, and I see, "I'm glad to see you in your habit, Father Franz." By this time, we'd had many meetings. I reached over to him and took his cross, which he had put under his shirt, his big olive wood cross. I said, "This goes out. This is who you are. This is an honor for us that you be in our synagogue like this." And I'm thankful that I had a congregation that understood that and went along, and I think learned from that as well. And over the course of 7 years, we did two things. They came to us for many holidays. I can remember once when Purim, I had some American students from the Jewish Theological Seminary that had come to help me read the Megillah. I'm not a good Megillah reader, so they read the Megillah. And they're standing in front and they're organizing and everything. And people are coming into this. We took a big auditorium for the occasion because all the children in the neighborhood would come. And one of them says to the other, "Oh, look at those three in the back. They're dressed up as nuns." And I said, no. They are nuns. They just came in their regular clothes. So we had so many precious prayers experience. I would come with congregants to them. The first year, Sasha came with me, and Sasha had never been. My wife Sasha had never been in a Christian prayer before, in a church. She'd been inside of a church, but never during the prayer time. We came for the midnight mass of Easter, and it's 2.5 hours long, and their liturgy is in French, and they do. I don't know if any of you have been in the Easter liturgy is very long. It's stations, right? And for one of the melodies, they sang that in French. They sang it to this melody. La 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 da da da. I la 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 da da da. I la 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 da 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 da. I la 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 la. And many of you may know that as David Melech Yisrael, one of Shlomo Carlebach's melodies. And I wasn't surprised, but Sasha was. And afterwards, we're greeting Father Franz, and he says to Sasha, and Sasha, how did you feel? How did you enjoy your first your first Catholic Mass? And she says, well, it was really interesting. I felt very much at home, but I was surprised that you used the Reb Shlomo Nigun. And he says to Sasha, if Rabbi David can steal our music, we can steal his. And that's kind of, this is sacred stealing. So here's another one of my rules. Is one to pray with the other, but also to engage in sacred theft, perhaps we'll call it. Now, later on, and so I'm not going chronologically, but later on I learned three important rules from a bishop, not directly, but the rules that were given, created, or first said by Christer Stendahl, who was the bishop at one time, was the bishop of Stockholm. And I learned this when I was in Stockholm, and really kind of the founder, or one of the founding people of Jewish Christian dialogue in Europe post-war. A lot of that dialogue revolved around guilt issues on the side of the Christians, demands for justice on the sides of Jews. And I kind of came in with that still being part of the dialogue when I was in Sweden, which I'll talk a little bit about later, perhaps. But for me, became something very, very different. And I learned from him these three rules from his writings. It's one particular article that he wrote about it, or speech that he gave. 3 rules, and these are guiding rules for me in any kind of intercultural, interfaith, interpersonal. One is to hear about the other person's faith tradition, to hear about the other person's religion from themselves, from those that practice that tradition. Right? It's not that you can't read about it, but if you want to know, it's not in a book. It's not, I heard that Muslims do this. I heard that I saw that Christians do this. No. Speak directly to the people who are practicing something else. Hear about that in a very personal way. And I think many of us have come a long way in the last few decades in that kind of dialogue with the other, to hear the stories, the personal narratives. That's the rule number 1. Rule number 2, don't compare their worst to your best, or your best to their worst. I think an example that comes to mind for me is, people say, look at the savagery of in the Crusades, or what fundamentalist Islam terror can bring. We have some of that in our history as well, in our not too distant history. And so let's kind of compare. When we compare, let's try to look for the things that are comparable. And then finally, which is my favorite one, is have a sense of holy envy, which means in some ways may lead to holy theft, as I just mentioned. But my example of holy envy was when I was in Stockholm, and I was invited to the opening of a new project called Guds Hus. And I'll talk more about that first meeting I had, God's House, with the imams and some of the various Christian leaders. But when it came time to dedicate that church that was part of God's house, which was to house a Protestant, a Catholic church, and a mosque in the same building, there were no Jews in the area that had no Jews whatsoever. It made no sense to have a synagogue there. But I was still involved and invited to be part of it. I remember the bishop came, Biscop Eva, who lived in our neighborhood. She and her wife were often guests in our home for Shabbat. We were there for holidays. The bishop, very short woman, she came with her staff. I think it's called something else. Is it a mitre? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe so. Anyway, it's his staff, with a hook staff, because she's a bishop with a tall hat. And I remember saying to myself, I got to get me one of those. If I'm the chief rabbi of Sweden, I should have a staff also. Right? To me, that's a sense of holy envy. Or if I go back to Taizé, seeing the young people after they've taken the communion from the brothers. By the way, the brothers at Taizé, they're the ones who give out, regardless if they're Roman Catholic or not. They're the ones who give out the communion to the different stations around the church itself. The bread has been blessed. And for those that want a Roman Catholic Eucharist, they come earlier in the morning to a crypt downstairs where there's a small Roman Catholic church. The bread's been blessed in that way, and so the brothers themselves, regardless of whether they're Catholic or not, they give out the communion. I'm envious when I see people at the Eucharist. I don't want to do it. I don't want to drink the blood of Christ and the body of Christ. I don't want to, but I'm envious of their experience. When I was once on Mount Olives, looking down at the Temple Mount, and saw during Ramadan, perhaps it was one of the Eids, thousands and thousands of men dressed in white, praying on the Temple Mount, and seeing them all bowing in unison. There's that sense of holy envy in me. That what a powerful kind of thing to be part of. So those three rules should come up all the time. And if somebody hears me say something that don't really go together with those rules, or they want to challenge, then please do so. And we're open this up for discussion. In just a minute, I realize I've been talking straight nonstop, but what I'm most proud of possibly is that during those for 7 years, it took a while to organize, and then I left for sabbatical in 2009. So I guess 2007 to 2009. We had a monthly study group of the Psalms together with the brothers and sisters of the Beatitude, and myself, some of my students, some people from Tel Aviv. We'd more often than not, we'd go up to the monastery. Instead, it was just easier for us to get around than for them. By the way, I also took the Bar Bat Mitzvah group there every year. It was an outing that we did of the group. I had about 10 kids, at any given time, maybe 12. And some of the parents would come, we'd drive up to the monastery. And one day I took a phone call, I stepped out, and when I came back, I see Father Franz leading the kids from out of this, it's called a sacristy. I forgot what it's called. It's the room where all their clothes are, all their stoles and things are, and where they store the wafers and the blood. And the kids are all munching on wafers. And I say, Franz, come on. He says, it's all right. I didn't bless them. It's all right. They're not sacred until I bless them. So that was another interesting experience. So before we go on, let me take a few questions or comments if you like, and then we'll go on and we'll begin looking at Psalm 24, the things that I discovered while I was studying with the Beatitudes in those years in Israel. We're talking about the Ots. Any comments or questions? I don't know if you're able to. All right, now you should be able to unmute. Does anybody want to say anything?
I could say something.
Please.
I thank you very much for this. It's such a wonderful talk from your experience of how tolerant we can be of other peoples and of other religions, whether they have been historically tolerant of us or not. And I think that is so important, um, for us to understand that and to be able to bridge any gaps that we might have.
So thanks. Sylvia, were you with us last week?
I caught the recording because I
So
wasn't.
okay, so I'm going to repeat something I said last week also, and these are the three. You remind me because you used the word tolerance. Another set of three rules from Professor Avi Ravitsky of the Hebrew University Department of Philosophy. It said that there are three terms that we should be interested in tolerance, and defining tolerance is when we have different views, but we don't kill each other. You might remember saying, well, we don't throw rocks at each other. That's tolerance. And that is an accomplishment in many ways, certainly even among Jews, that's often an accomplishment. And then there's pluralism, which means that I have my truth, the other has their truth, and I recognize the other's truth as their own, but just not for me. And then there's openness, where I'm willing to let my guard down, perhaps. That's not his words, but I'm willing to see what truth I might find in the other's truth. And another set of three rules hovering behind us. Anything else? Yes, Corinne. Just need you to unmute, Corinne.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I couldn't unmute before. Thank you. What you said really echoes within me because I come from a Catholic background, and often I heard that some Jewish tune that I'm accustomed to now, I hear from the Catholic services, it was taken from Judaism. Well, my question is in interfaith. I live in a neighborhood where there is a Muslim, there are Christians of different denominations, Buddhists, my next door neighbors, but I'm really scared to kind of open up and talk about the real thing to somebody of Muslim faith. Maybe because of my prejudices, I kind of be embarrassed or either too upfront or too hypocritical, I don't know. But it's hard for me to break the ice, and I want to because I feel I need to open a dialogue, but I don't know how to get started. Could you help?
So Corinne, for those of you who don't know, she lives in Mauritius, off the right hand would be the eastern coast of Africa, and is in a very different situation. She's also relatively new to the Jewish tradition, and I mentioned that, Corinne, I feel confident. I hope that was all right that I mentioned it, because that's part of my answer to you, is that one of the ways that I am able to do this kind of work is that I feel so secure in my Judaism and so immersed in my Judaism. And because I've been in different kinds of Judaism, and I was raised in a home, a liberal-minded home with liberal values in a home, and I turned to Orthodoxy as a young man, and then eventually found my way back to liberalism in Judaism and in politics as well, I might say. That I feel that I have some experience in the words and the language of different places, and that perhaps gives me a sense of self-confidence that many others wouldn't necessarily have. I also have a rich background. Thankfully, I have the rich background in academic study, so I've been exposed to many different kinds of traditions and understandings. It's not for everyone, Corinne. It's not for everyone to do, and sometimes the best thing is if there are just opportunities to listen, and if one doesn't need to express anything because one doesn't necessarily feel they can control their emotions, or they can that they will show any expertise. I think listening to the other is very, very important. You listen to me, you listen to others. You're in touch, as far as I know, with many different online study groups, Jewish study groups in North America. It's good to try to listen to the other, especially a neighbor, to feel, and if you can, but it's just a question of and not biting off more than one can chew. I got into trouble a little bit when years later, I'm sorry, we're going back to Taizé, probably 2007 or 8. I told about when I organized for the leaders of the youth movement, of the conservative Judaism, the Masorti youth movement in Israel, for the leaders to come with some Palestinian youth, Catholic youth, to Taizé, and the Palestinians couldn't come in the end. And I assumed that I had prepped these young people enough, while our daughter Debbie, who grew up with this and grew up with Father Franz at the Seder table every year, who's now a rabbi in Jerusalem, Debbie was fine with this, but two of her friends, in fact, one of them had to leave. One of them left Taizé after 2-3 days. He was originally from the former Soviet Union. His father was a member of his father was a very prominent politician. He thought he was open enough for this, but when it got to it, he could not take the prayers at Taizé and the cross and the imagery and everything like that. So it's tricky stuff, and it takes a lot of preparation. But I think to listen is we should always challenge ourselves by listening. That would be the first step. Let's take a break now, and we'll get some comments afterwards, but let's take a look, at least for the next few minutes. I'd really kind of like to finish this. This is the Psalm. We're not going to read through the whole thing. This is Psalm 24 that we have in our own liturgy, in our Jewish liturgy. And the part that gets down to, first of all, the way that it begins, the Lord owns the earth and all that it contains, the world and all that live in it, appropriate for this week's Torah portion, Breshit, creation of the world. If you look at verse number 7, look up, you gates, rise up, you eternal donors. Then the majestic king will enter. Does anybody know what those Hebrew words are? Su sharim rashechem, v'nasu pitchei olam. Right, go ahead. Chazan, please sing one of the melodies for us, please.
I'll sing one of the, there are two that I'm very familiar with. שאו שערים ראשיכם ושאו פתחי, right. יבוא מלך הכבוד, מי הוא זה מלך הכבוד? אדוני צבאות שמו, הוא מלך הכבוד סלה.
Thank you. And of course, the cantor chooses the very cantorial operatic one, known from, my guess is that's Lewandowski.
It's choral. It's a choral setting.
Yeah. And the one that and I know that from shuls, the one that I grew up with, that especially at weddings and other ceremonies, so anyway, this is in the fiber of my Jewish being is this psalm, and it appears it's the psalm for Sundays in our prayer book. It's used on festivals or days when you take out the Torah scroll that are not Shabbat, and so this idea of the gates opening up. So we got to this psalm. I picked the psalm usually, or that we traded up. I picked the psalm, they picked the psalm, and we'd go through the text, and they knew Hebrew. They could all read Hebrew. So it was I'm back to the Beatitudes near Latrun in Israel. And I would bring additional material. And because I was just also a little bit better in looking for things online and things like that, very often I would bring some of the Christian material. Although one of them in particular, she was rather learned, and she would often bring us, with St. Jerome's commentary on Psalms, and I'll have a comment to make about that afterwards. But first, let's take a look at Midrash Shmot Rabbah. If somebody would like to read, Megan, would you like to read for us number 6?
Solomon recited this verse when he was trying to get the ark into the Holy of Holies. He made an ark 10 cubits high, into which he put the old one and carried it. Then he arrived at the gate of the temple. It turned out that the opening was only 10 cubits high. and the ark was 10 cubits, and they couldn't get it through, not to mention the fact that they were carrying it. So when he tried to get it through, they couldn't. Solomon stood there embarrassed and didn't know what to do. So he began praying to the praised Holy One, saying, "Lift up your heads, O gates, O eternal doors." But they asked him, "Who is the King of glory?" "The God of hosts is the King of glory, Selah," he answered. As soon as he said that, they relinquished. Otherwise, they would have chopped off his head and killed him.
A rather extremely worded midrashic tradition. It appears in different places, other places as well, with slightly different details. But so here you have a psalm that David purportedly, according to tradition, wrote that says, "O earth, lift up your gates, lift up your heavenly gates." What could possibly be the gates here? Who's saying lift up? Where is this coming from? And the Midrash places that text, takes it out of its context and places it into a new context, as Midrash does, as much of New Testament literature will do with Hebrew biblical literature, as so many traditions that use sacred text do. They take the text out of its context and place it in a particularly new one. Now, what's exactly the situation? Solomon has built a new temple to God, and the ark has been resting someplace else. They bring it. Perhaps this has happened to you when you try to move a refrigerator, and the refrigerator is I'm making up 62 inches high, and you have a space. Oh, it'll fit here. It's 62 inches high. Well, 62 inches high doesn't fit into 62 inches high. There's going to be that little chukchik of an area that you've got to, and that's exactly that. It's like, oh no, we blew it. It's like, it's so humorous. It's like a cartoon almost, You could imagine him saying, "What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Oh, let's resort to prayer. Lift up the gates." So God magically lifted up those gates so they get the ark through the door, right? When many Christians see this kind of midrash, those that have not studied midrash before, they just think, some think it's ridiculous. Like, that's not connected at all. Where are we get? And some people feel that they feel it's charming. That's been my experience over the years, and that's part of my job in interfaith dialogues, to introduce other people of other faiths into rabbinic modes of interpretation. But the important part here, for me, is of course not the content, but it's the recycling of the ancient text in a different way that makes sense. Because lift up your gates, to those that were saying it in the synagogue in rabbinic times, they were just not what could that possibly mean? And that, of course, brought me to my background in biblical literature and looking up the commentaries, to discover that of the literature from Ugarit, ancient Ugarit, which is from the early part of the first millennium BCE, literature that is very similar. The language of Ugarit or Ugaritic is very similar to ancient Hebrew, and there are many similarities where the same lines from Psalms appear. We see them from hundreds of years beforehand, and we realize that the Psalms themselves have often recycled. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but they often recycled, reused, taken, recontextualized whole lines. And one of the lines is in the epic of Baal. Baal is the rain fertility god of ancient Canaan, who is destroyed, beaten by the god Mot, like the word Mavet in Hebrew, god of death, in the summertime. And this epic myth has different versions of different parts around the Levant. In Greco-Roman culture, it has one as well. And so let's just call the good guy god of fertility is defeated by the bad guy god in June, July. Tammuz is connected to that as well, the Hebrew name for the Babylonian name for that month. And after 3 months of dryness, where when you look in that part of the world, and kind of our part of the world in many ways as well, where the summer is so dry, there's nothing is, the land dies, and the god of death is in charge. And after 3 months, the Baal finds his way back upwards because he's been thrown into the ground by Mot. And after 3 months, he shouts out and says, from below, O earth, open up your gates. And therefore is able to come out. That's in the Ugaritic, that's in the ancient Canaanite myth. So before I go, and before it's hard for me to handle that somebody would use our Psalms, whether it's the rabbis or whether it's another religion, what becomes Christianity, use Hebrew scripture for something else. First of all, we've all done it. Right? Many of you may know that the Temple Mount became, after the destruction of the temple, it was a Roman pagan temple, which is why Helene Hamalka, Helene, the Queen Helene, established a church there, which is why that became eventually the third holiest place for Islam, because that's what you do. You take over the previous people's religious spot. And some of you may also know that, although it can't be proven, but archaeologists most certainly assume that the Temple Mount was an ancient Canaanite holy spot before it became the Temple of Israel. In other words, it's something that we do all the time. And so it was done beforehand. But then the interesting part, now I'd like to go, I want to go to, instead of, just one moment, instead of a text, I want to show you, instead of a word text, I want to show you a different kind of text. And again, the link is no longer, I'm sorry, give me a second. Meanwhile, perhaps whoever wants, if somebody had their hand up, go ahead and ask the question while I look for this icon to show you. Please go ahead.
Unmute yourself, Rosalie. Unmute yourself. I think we lost her. Something happened. Hopefully she'll get back on.
Okay, I'll have an image up in just a moment. I thought for sure that the link would work, but
Coming back. And Rosalie, I think if you want to say what you had to say, you can say it now. I see you're back.
Okay, we'll take the question afterwards. If you take a look at this, please. Okay, can you see it? All right, so this is from a particular monastery in Lebanon, but it's a common theme. I'm gonna have to find another one that we'll have to get this to, and I don't really know how to get there we go. Okay, so anybody care to tell me what we're looking at?
Oh, I think we're looking at, at first I thought we were looking at the ascension because of the angels, but maybe not.
Okay, so can we agree who this character is?
Jesus.
Okay. I can't, go ahead and just speak. Go ahead, Suzanne, just go ahead and say. Ask to unmute. You have your hand up. It just asked to unmute.
Okay, great. Yeah. Jesus and maybe 12 apostles.
Yeah, even though there's not 12 exactly, but that seems to be the idea. You've got angels above. Who are the two down below?
I think that's Mary and Joseph, because in much of the teachings, we are taught that Mary was Christians are taught that Mary was at the crucifixion and was at his feet.
Okay. So this is post, right? You can see this is post crucifixion. This is hard. So most people would say the same thing that you said, Sylvia. So in some ways, it's a little bit of a trick question. But the truth is that this, and you find this in different icons, maybe I need to find a better one. This is Christ rising from the depths, and in his hands, holding by his hands are not Joseph and Mary, but Adam and Eve. Because in Christ rising, he's redeeming the redemption of humanity, salvation of humanity. Now, the verse, and I chose not to bring the text here, but the verse that is used, it's understood from this is Christ saying from the depths, Su sha'arim rashechem unasu pitro v'isu pitro olam. Right? May the openings of the earth open up for me. May God open those gates coming from below. And the fascinating thing, of course, with this is this brings us full circle back to the ancient Canaanite myth. And if I had to choose which of these make the most sense from a spiritual point of view, now comes the audacity, now comes the spiritual promiscuity that somebody once accused me and Levi Wyman Kelman of, right? If I had to choose any of these, those would make much more sense than the very entertaining and humorous situation where Solomon's stuck with the refrigerator that can't get through the kitchen door. So this is not about what is the truth, the meaning of the text. The meaning of the text is in the Psalms, the way we have it is symbolic. It's symbolic meaning of God's power, because if God created the earth, God can do, and he can raise gates of the entrance of the world. It can mean all sorts of different things, and we could spend, and we did at the time, we could spend many, many weeks just on this psalm. It's a wonderful psalm, but I wanted to give you just that example of how, first of all, we can learn not just from word text, but also from art. And you've seen that. We've done that. All of us have done that before. I think most of us in other contexts, with me sharing with you the collection, the Gross family collection, but also to be open to understanding why one may make a little bit more sense in different situations. From the time of death, min hametzar karati, as we so said yesterday in Rosh Chodesh, and thought of, from the depths I call out for you, God. There may be we may be able to find some worth in this as well. This is a holy stealing perhaps as well. Rosalie, go ahead.
I had never heard of your interpretation or truth or whatever it is about lift up your heads, O ye gates. I always assumed that it meant to let people in to heaven. So this is very interesting, and I like it. I like your interpretation, or whatever it is that you said about carrying the ark. I had never ever, has anyone else heard that? Picking the ark up and it doesn't fit like the refrigerator. Where does that, I mean, that's Jewish.
That's Midrash. It's in the Talmud in a slightly different sense.
Oh, it is in the Talmud.
Yeah, but
Okay.
Midrash is Talmudic literature, right? It's all from the same first millennium, the Common Era. This is a Midrash Rabbah is a little bit later, but yeah, it's not medieval; it's pre-medieval.
But the Catholics sing it as letting themselves into, please God, let us into heaven.
Is that a statement or a question?
It's a question.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't remember. One of the things we learned from that, and I didn't take copulous notes and all this, right? I mean, I didn't imagine that I would be speaking about this to a group in Orange County and other places, 20 years later. But a few things came out of this, Rosalie, and so this is a good time to talk about these ongoing conversations I had these study groups that we did, my students and members of my congregation in Ramat Aviv and the brothers and sisters of the Beatitudes, is number one, is that we found a few things that are different. Besides this kind of these fantastic, sometimes humorous commentaries in rabbinic writings, as opposed to the far more serious writings of the church fathers from the same period of time. One thing we found was, and I was going to give, we won't get to it, but very often when there's something in the Psalms, we'll look in our Midrash and we'll see, well, that was David when this was happening. And then somebody say, oh, or it was Abraham when this was happening, or it was Solomon when this was happening, or it was Ezra, or it was Sarah, or it was Naomi. It was that you find these, and that's the beauty of our commentary. There is no one truthful answer. There's no one right answer. There's different situations that you, the individual, may very well find yourself in. So go for it. Let Naomi be your role model, even if she's a woman. Let Abraham be your role model, even if he's a man, that kind of a thing. In church fathers, it's all roads lead to Jesus in the Psalms. I don't remember if there probably are exceptions, but that's the general rule. And that's just that's a Jesus-centric, Christ-centric way of looking at the Psalms in general of scriptures. And so that's a difference to be aware of, not to criticize necessarily, but to be aware of and find and try to say, so what does that mean? What does that mean? And what does that mean for you as a Christian? I'm speaking to, what does that mean for us as having this dialogue? But yeah, those are some of the things that come up. Another thing we did, we always began with where does the Psalm feature in our liturgy? And one of the things I found out was the more important, and somebody's probably studied this in an academic way. I didn't, but this is my what's it called? Not academic, but experience. My
Thesis?
no, the
Oh,
opposite.
no.
Just from
Oh,
experience.
it begins with an E.
Okay.
Instead of
Empiric. Thank you.
subjective, objective, or
Empiric.
empiric.
Thank you. So my empirical study or knowledge tells me that the Psalms that are super key Psalms for Christianity, for Christology, are nowhere to be found in Jewish liturgy, on regular liturgy. Of course, there are people that say every Psalm, and some people have a weekly, a monthly, the order that they do every day. They'll say Psalms, they're constantly using that in a liturgical fashion. But in the prayer book itself, not all 150 Psalms are used. Lines are used from them in so many different things that we don't recognize as Psalms, like the Shmoneh Esrei, like all of the prayers for the High Holy Days, right? Tons of Psalms. But a Psalm, it seems to me that Psalms that are central to Christian theology were kind of avoided, and that would be my thesis, but that's what I saw empirically that would have to be studied seriously. Other comments or questions?
Avoided by us because we didn't want anybody to make the comparison between us and Christians. Is that?
I think I think that perhaps let me set up a totally hypothetical situation. You have a place in you have a place in the liturgy wasn't established so early, but let's say there's a place in the 2nd century in the diaspora where there's a synagogue which are of Christ believers in Christ, and there's another synagogue which do not accept Christ, and they're using that psalm, and somebody comes there for a bar mitzvah and they hear that psalm, and a psalm that they use in their prayer, and they just heard a sermon on that psalm which connected it intrinsically to Christ, then it becomes a problematic one, right? Many people look at. I remember when I was in high school, I think we found out, somebody discovered that Ein Keloheinu, Ein Kadonenu is a hymn it's music from the German church, right? And it was, and some of the people said, well, we shouldn't be singing it. It's treif because it's a Christian melody, right? Or I was at Camp Ramah once. I was just there in that spot yesterday for a bar mitzvah, and one of the counselors were leading, did something about the 10 Commandments for the kids, and they used the melody of on the first day of Christmas, something like that. And there was somebody visiting there who stood up and said, "You can't. That's treif. You can't use a melody from Christmas for what's wrong with you people? Where are the educators?" Something like that, right? So I would say, my whole message here is that we can do it, and we do it. But I recognize in the past that it's been more problematic. Anything else before we go? I again, not terribly focused, not nearly as focused as our regular study, but.
Well, I would say, unless somebody else has something to say, thank you so much, Rabbi. This has been a really fascinating class. And as always, your contribution to us at ALI is amazing. And we hope to see everybody again soon, next week. If not before, if next week, if not before. And Rabbi will be back, and we will look forward to seeing you back. And if you missed any of this, we are on, it's been recorded, so it'll be on, you'll find it on YouTube, you'll find it on Facebook, and you'll find it on our website. And just so, I just want to put our, if for some reason you don't have this, put our information in the chat. Yeah, if I could type, it'd be great. We do also, I just want to say, which I'm not very good at saying these kind of things, but I'm gonna. We do not want anybody to miss anything because of constraints with money, but if you would like to, if you'd like to contribute at any time, it's not coming. Oh, I see what the problem is.
Okay, Sylvia, I think that folks can
Yeah.
find us. I've got to go in any case, so I'm saying goodbye. Thank you for
All right,
everything.
there it is. Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you very much. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night. Goodbye, everybody. Come back next week. Thank you.